I'm happy to be able to do this for you.
Turnaround's fair play.
Yeah, right. Well, what is your full name?
Robert Frederick Wernle.
And where were you born, Bob?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, November 15th, 1914.
1940.
Well,
Well,
76 years old.
yeah, well, you're just 4 years younger than I, and the same year my brother Bill was born. He was also in the mountain. What about your education, early education?
Well, I was born in Chicago, of course, but when we were there, my brother and sister and I were young. My dad and mother decided that they wanted us children to go to the Evanston school, so we moved over to Evanston. And I went to the Evanston school, graduated from high school there, and then went on to Northwestern University to the liberal arts school right there on the Evanston campus. And then after I graduated from the liberal arts school, went downtown to the law school for 3 years. So I'm 7 years at Northwestern.
Now, is the downtown campus the medical school down that same area?
Right next to
Erie Street and Ohio?
The medical school and dental
Across here?
school. Yeah, it's all there together. So I lived at home and went back and forth to the law school downtown.
Well, and then what got you to Crawfordsville?
Well, I'm married into Crawfordsville.
Oh, you did?
After the war, after I graduated from law school, I took the Illinois bar and I went out to practice in a little town in western Illinois, and was there for a little while, and then I was working for another lawyer, and then I went up to a place called Mount Carroll and hung out my own shingle there. But in the spring of 1941, I was there in Mount Carroll, and things began to, dark clouds began to gather, and I knew I was going to have to go in the service. So along about late in the early fall or middle of the fall, I closed up my office in Mount Carroll, and I was drafted in and went in as a private. I remember, I'm getting to how I got married.
That's all right.
I went into I can remember that situation, the draft board. We assembled down at the Elks Club there on Dempster Street in Evanston, and my dad and mother came down. This was December 10th, 1942 or 1941. So it was right after about the declaration of war. And I tell you what, you don't have many more solemn situations in your life. And my dad and mother came down there, and we'd never been much of a kissing family. I'll tell you what.
You were there.
I kissed my mother goodbye, and even kissed my dad goodbye.
Great.
And they had a bus there, took us downtown and into the Loop. And the only fellow I knew in that group of draftees, I suppose there were 20, 30 of us, something like that, was a fellow named Corny Champion. He'd been a halfback on a football team back in Evanston High School, and he was the only one I knew. And he was black. Evanston wasn't quite as segregated as a lot of communities are, and he and I kind of palled up, and we rode down on the bus together and went into the center there where we had the physicals, and then we met outside. And, lo and behold, I got my first taste of segregation in the Army, because he was black and he was going to Camp Custer, and I was white, I was going to Camp Grant. They took all the black fellows and they all went to Camp Custer, and we went to Camp Grant. Well, I got out to Camp Grant and went through all that
The basic training.
rigmarole. No, I never
before.
you know, getting shoes.
Oh, yeah.
They misfit you on shoes and get your uniforms and all that, and being what, private, 21 bucks a month, why? Most of what I remember from being there in the early days at the reception center was after dark, I mean before dawn, because they used to get us up in the morning, you know, and some guy would come in, a sergeant would come in and flick on that switch, you know, and all the lights would go on. Yeah. And by the way, you know, I didn't ask you about short arm inspection. Did you used to do that?
Why, indeed. That was one of the doctor's jobs, dude.
I'm still, that's the first time I'd ever had that experience in the service. Well, and we'd get out there, and we did. Of course, it was in December, and it was all was dark, and we'd all line up there, and they'd start calling the roll for who was going to get KP. And my name, beginning with a W, they never got to the W.
Oh, they didn't.
They kept flowing in, so I never had a KP. And but along the way at the reception center, I met another fellow I knew. His name was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Oh, the poet himself.
But he'd been a tackler. I think he'd been a tackle on the Northwestern football team I'd known back in school, and he was an interviewer there at the reception center. And I think he was already a sergeant or something. So he said, well, he asked me how I'd like to come to work and be an interviewer at the reception center, which sounded pretty good to me. So I had orders to go to the Signal Corps, but they pulled me on that and put me in the reception center. And I stayed in the reception center for several months, interviewing draftees, inductees coming into the service, and sending them off to old Fort Leonard Wood.
Well, did you try to pick out areas where they would probably people
you'd look at their background, and you'd pick out, you'd look at their scores on their AGCT, and you'd look at their education and so on. You'd try to pick a place that was appropriate for them to go, and that's what I did for 3 or 4 months, something like that. And I never went to basic training. Along the line came an opportunity to go into investigator school at the Provost Marshal General. But no, an investigator, the headquarters of the Provost Marshal General, which was down in the Loop in Chicago, Pacific Conference. And I took the opportunity, I took the chance, and they sent me down there, and I was to be an investigator. And so they sent me downtown to a big clothing store, I don't remember what it was, and fitted us up in civilian clothes. I used my usual bad taste in selecting a suit.
Well, this was sort of the Army's FBI, wasn't it?
Well, it was a lot of, really, when I look back, it was a lot of, looked to me like a lot of monkey business, but they at that time were filling a lot of sensitive positions, both in the civilian category and in the military. And we fellows went around and called on employers and neighbors on that sort of thing.
Trying to weed out the subversive.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what I did for a while, and got promoted to. Went from when I got there, where they promoted me to sergeant, buck sergeant. I was just 1 striker or 3 striker, and this is how I got to know my wife.
Good. I want to forget the story now.
She was a friend of my sister.
Uh-huh.
And my sister kind of picked her out for me. That's the way it was.
Good.
We met, and of course she thought I was hot stuff running around in the Army in plain clothes. they told us, you know, we weren't supposed to talk about what we were doing, but it was really kind of monkey business. But I traveled during that summer, and I traveled up in northern Illinois and Wisconsin, upper Michigan, up in that area. And made a circuit around.
Well, now tell us what your wife's maiden name was and how she's associated with Carlson.
My wife is Marion Griffith Curtis, and she was the daughter of Walter Curtis, who was the actuary at Ben Hur Line for many years. And of course, they were friends of your family, and so then in the middle of that summer, middle of '42, I got a chance to go to a school down at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, which was an investigator school, a training in fingerprinting and
the technology.
Yeah, shadowing people, that kind of stuff.
You should have had a brain coach, didn't you have a brain coach?
And the commandant of the school was Melvin Purvis. You probably have heard of him. Melvin Purvis. Yeah. He's the guy that captured, or I guess they shot Dillinger with the FBI. And toward the end of the course, I don't even remember how it was, 8 weeks, maybe something like that. There were 7 of us out of that class. I don't remember how many people were in the class, maybe 30 or 40, something like that. There were 7 of us. Pulled off the line and pulled out a little bit early, and we were told we were shipping off together. They wouldn't tell us where we were going, but four of us were lawyers, and I think and 3 were CPAs or something like that. So we were called out and told we were specially selected. And we went first to, as I recall it, we went to Camp Butner, North Carolina, which was a staging area. And 3 fellows who were already staff sergeants were sent on ahead. And they went a different route from us. The 4 of us went from Butner out to California. Bob Campbell mentioned a troop train yesterday. We went out on a troop train. It was some trip, right? Some trip. We were blacked out, of course, at night. The train was blacked out. We got out to Pittsburgh Landing in California, and the other fellows were going on ahead, and 3 of them. So we stayed there at Pittsburgh Landing. It's up on the river, up above San Francisco there, you know. It's still there. It's a big Navy base, I think, now. And about 2 weeks later, early in December, we got on board the Ile-de-France, huge liner. The ship was docked there underneath, right near the Golden Gate Bridge, and there were just jillions of us seemed to be pouring on that ship.
Well, now, wait a minute, you said early December. Was this December of '42 then?
No, December of 42, that's right.
Yeah.
That would have been December of 42.
This is a whole year after you'd been inducted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was about a year after I'd been inducted that we got on board that ship. And I can remember getting on that ship. I never got seasick all the time I was out. It never bothered me a bit. We had some awful storms, and I still didn't get seasick. But I remember like one of the guys that I was kind of buddy with, a guy named Series. You know, it's funny, you remember these names back, these fellows you buddied up with as you went through the service. You didn't have that in being an officer. I was enlisted, man.
Well, we had a lot of officers that feel the same way about it.
Well, I remember George Series. He was a cryptographer, and he and I were buddies, and he got on the ship, and we no more than got on that ship, he started turning green, and I don't know whether he ever got anything to eat at all. But we were on so we sailed off on the Ile-de-France, and I talked to, and yesterday I asked Bob Campbell about whether he ever took a shower on board ship.
Salt water.
Salt water. It was salt water. And saltwater toilets and saltwater showers. And we were down in steerage. I was down in one of the hammocks. There's a guy up here on a hammock, and I was here, and there's another guy over here on a hammock, and two of them down below.
Right.
I think there were 15,000 people, 15,000 troops on board that ship. And Judas Priest, you know, eating. The cooks were all Indians. It was a British crew.
Oh.
And the cooks were all Indians.
East Indians.
They were dark. And they'd stand behind those great big vats cooking mutton.
Oh my God.
Then they'd be sweating. And I told my wife after we got back, you know, we used to line up in the morning for breakfast, and we'd stand in a great big long line and be forever getting our first meal. And we'd get through with our first meal. We ate out of our canteens, you know. We had our canteens and our mess kits and so on. And by the time you get done with your first meal, you'd be ready to line up for the second meal. You'd have 2 meals.
Yeah, 2 meals.
2 meals a day. Yeah. Well, the officers, of course, slept up. They had bunks, but we were down there with where we could.
The hammer.
They put us right close to the engines and the gyroscope.
Did you know where you were going, Bob, when you
you know, by the time we got to, the way we found out was there was some officer when we were there at Butler who was in the library, and he had out a book, and he had the book open to Persian. So we knew from that he knew where he was going, and we figured we were going the same place. And so we were. We sailed out. We had no escort, by the way. There were no.
Well, the big ships were fast enough now.
There was a fast ship, and we blacked out at night. But they would go one way and then jump the other way. And I think our first stop was at Honolulu. We stopped at Pearl Harbor, and of course we saw all the devastation there. But I only got out on the dock. I didn't get to go into. Then we sailed from there, and we didn't stop until we got to Wellington, New Zealand. And I could remember, by that time they took us off the ship. And I'll tell you, that was a moving sight, because they had 15,000 American ships, American soldiers. They paraded us down the main street of Wellington, New Zealand. And I don't know whether you've ever been to Wellington, New Zealand, but the town is down by the dockside. But the heights go way up. There's just kind of a mountain up there, and there are houses all over the side of that mountain. And you could see these people looking out at us, and they were scared to death of the Japs at that time, because they thought the Japs were coming, and to see these 15,000 American troops parading down there on the street was quite a thrill for them. And you could see them, they'd hang out British flags or American flags, and it was...
By the way, I mean, there were other troops besides you. Were they armed? I mean, they all had their rifles?
Oh, we all had our rifles. Oh, yeah, we all had our...
Were you carried arms too?
Oh, sure, yeah. And, every soldier on there had his, we had Springfields, we didn't have M1 at that time.
You have a gas mask?
Oh, no, I don't think we did. I don't think we did. But we sailed from, we were there on Wellington, New Zealand, I think I believe right after Christmas, or right about Christmas. And I can remember the singing Christmas carols and things down there in the hold of the ship. Well, of course, we stayed on ship all the time. We bunked, hanging in those hammocks. And we got, and our next stop was Fremantle, Australia. We didn't even, the ship didn't even go into Perth. It stayed out at Fremantle, and they took small ships out and reprovisioned.
Lighters, they call
Lighters.
I'm not a Navy man, but
yeah. And we went from there to Bombay. At Bombay, all of the men from CBI, China, Burma, India, got off the ship, left us. There was a very large, I think there were 10,000 men going to CBI, China, Burma, India. And they got off there at Bombay, and they moved us off onto some small British ships, and those were, I don't know how big they were, but this was called, I remember the name of that ship, it was a New Ralia. It sounded like New Ralia. And of course, then we sailed across the Indian Ocean. And I remember, of course, we'd been blacked out all the way, and we were still blacked out. But when you got into the Arabian Sea, and you were at night, and the moon was out, or there was at least a bit of light, the Arabian Sea it reminds me of wink and blink and nod.
Iridescent?
Iridescent, yeah. Where you could,
I guess these are organisms in the
organisms in the sea, and they're just, it's really quite a sight.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, we went, we moved up through the Straits of Hormuz, which is there at the, where the Arabian Peninsula and Iran come together, and moved up into the Persian Gulf. And we docked at Khorramshahr. Khorramshahr was the terminus for the Trans-Iranian Railroad. And we got off the ship, and we got off that ship, and pitched tents out there in the desert. And this was in the last of January. We had been on board ship for 48 days.
Ooh. 40 days and 40 nights.
So 48 days on board ship, and not sleeping in the bed, sleeping in a hammock all that time. And I wondered how I ever, most of those fellas on there was an awful lot of card playing and crap shooting on board ship. I've never been a gambling man. I didn't do any of that. So I read more books on that trip than I ever read in any single period of my life.
But
there was a library on
that
ship, and I read a good many books. I remember Jane Eyre and all those.
Were you allowed out of the hold?
Oh yeah, we got
up on deck.
During the deck, and we'd lie around on board deck, and there'd be a crap game going on over here, and a card game going on over there. We'd be sitting underneath a lifeboat or something like that. But that's the way. And we landed there at Khorramshahr, and it was in late January, the end of January. And you'd think when you were down in that desert, you'd think it would be pretty cold, pretty hot. Well, it was hot during the daytime, but it was colder than really be damned at night. we were in these tents and sleeping on the ground, and it got it down. I don't know how cold it got, but it was awful cold. And we spent about 2 weeks there on the desert. And then we got on board a train, and there was those old cars on the Iranian Railroad. The locomotives were diesels, and it was a wonderful railroad. The Swiss had built it. The Swiss had built the railroad. That was a great engineering masterpiece. Went up through, I don't know how many tunnels there are between there and Teheran, but they took us all up to Teheran, at least all of our group, but the sleeping conditions were horrible in those old wooden cars, and the toilet facilities, you can imagine, were terrible. But and it was like, when you get when you got up there, of course, a lot of mountains, a lot of mountains there around, and you went through those mountains. It's like going on the Valley of the Moon. You just rocks and sand and more rocks and more sand. And we got up to Teheran, and the four of us fellows who had been in school together, were assigned to the intelligence section of the headquarters there in Teheran. And our bosses were very interesting guys. One of them had been a Presbyterian. He was a colonel, Colonel Wright, Presbyterian minister, missionary there in Iran.
Oh.
And
so he knew the language?
Yeah, he knew the language, and we had Iranian, Farsi language courses and Iranian history and that sort of thing from him, and that was a kind of an interesting life. At first we lived down, and by the way, we met our other three buddies were already there when we got there, and they were kind of in on the ground floor. But we lived downtown in Teheran in an apartment at first. And then after a while they got a camp built up on beyond downtown, around up toward the foothills of the mountains, and we moved up there. I think the reason that we fellows had been sent over there, they were in all of the Allied arms and vehicles and all of the supplies to Russia. This was the lifeline to Russia.
Oh, yeah.
And they had been afraid that there would be sabotage, and that was supposedly our mission to prevent that. As it turned out, that really didn't ever materialize. The worst thing that they ever, the worst problems they had were pilferage from some soldiers themselves. Some soldiers going in and stealing the stuff and black marketing the stuff, or
cigarettes,
or they get into a carload of canned goods or something and sell it on a black market. That was most of what they had. Sabotage. Everybody was afraid of the Germans. It was right next to Turkey, where there were a lot of Germans. They weren't sure whether there were going to be Germans coming over there and getting into causing problems. But as it turned out, it wasn't that way. And now after it'd been there for a while.
Now wait a minute, you're getting into
we're up in
now.
Teheran. We're up in Teheran, and this is 43.
Yeah.
Early in 43.
43. Okay.
And three of us fellows the three of us, Bernie Darren, he was in the U.S. Labor, he worked for the Labor Department. John Cave was a lawyer, and I were made warrant officers because we were made that because they made us the base censors. We were in charge of censorship.
Well, your TOME called for a warrant officer, I suppose. And you had not been promoted since you were buck sergeant, is that right?
No, I'm still a buck sergeant. So I was assigned as the base censor at Teheran. John Cave was made the censor down on the desert, and Bernie Darren was the censor over at Basra. You've heard a lot about Basra.
Yeah. Not much left of it right now.
No, but he was the censor over there. And the other guys, the other four, continued in their work. These guys were, well, they were damn good cops, if you want to say.
Yeah.
Phil Copstein was a little guy. He's still, by the way, he's still alive. He's older, 4 years older than I am. He was an agent for the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau. And Harvey St. Jean was a cop in Miami Beach. And Marvin Boyd later got to be chief of police in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was a cop from Chattanooga. Milton Fields was he was a CPA and a lawyer. He'd gone to Northwestern Law School. He graduated from Northwestern Law School. Cave was a lawyer. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. And there was, I think I mentioned them all.
Yeah, I did.
But anyway.
And you.
Yeah, and me.
You did.
And, well, anyway, they assigned me, God, they'd bring in these mailboxes, mail bags, you know, and I'd have to go through them. Even the general's letters, we'd have to pick a few of them out.
What troops were there, Bob, that you were supervising? That is, you were reading their, censoring their mail.
Well, it was Transportation Corps.
Oh, okay.
The main, of course, I was in the headquarters of the command.
Yeah.
It was the command of the whole. We were in the headquarters of the command. And these were a lot of quartermasters, truck drivers, railway engineers, trainmen, that sort of thing. And I mentioned that thing about that black fellow. And I don't know whether you ran into this where you were, but we were segregated.
Yeah, we were.
They have a whole battalion of black fellows, black quartermasters. There were no, maybe a white officer.
Truckers, primarily.
Truckers, yeah, a lot of truckers, quartermasters. Not many railwaymen were black, but the railwaymen were mostly white. Now, you see, there were two lines of supplies coming up. There was one line run by one of the trucks, and the other line on the train. And the trains were hauling up, they were going up, and they would meet Russian trains up north at the border, and then the Russians would take over and move it on. And then the truckers would come up. They came up a different route, and they would meet the Russians. The Russians take over.
Is this true, Bob, that the Russian train gauge was different from others, and they had to transfer all of the material?
Yeah, they had to switch. Now, as a matter of fact, I think north of Tabriz in Iran, it was the Russian gauge. I'm not sure whether the Russian gauge took up took over at the Russian border, or whether it was,
Now, was your railroad a standard gauge or?
standard gauge, yeah. It was built, as I said, it was built by the Swiss.
Yeah, that's fine.
Like the German railroads and the
Right.
Swiss railroads. Well, where am I?
Well, you're toward the end of 43, still did
Oh.
censored mail.
Okay. Well, somewhere along the line there, they decided that that censored mail was a lot of foolishness.
Oh, really?
And so we got, we didn't, and so they assigned me over into the G1 section, which I suppose where I was handling personnel and that sort of thing. And by the way, the new colonel I had there was Harvard Purvis.
Oh.
Spelled the same way. I don't know
Not
whether
the-
it's
not
an relation or
related.
not. Colonel Purvis. And I was working there, and Teheran was a real interesting place to be during the war. There was a lot of excitement going on there. We had all kinds of troops. We had all nationalities here. We go downtown to the Continental restaurant, and next to you, at the next table to you, there'd be people talking French, or maybe over here they'd be talking Turkish, or over here they're talking Russian. It was just Polish, just almost French, most anything, or
A few Americans.
and
English.
lots of English and Americans, yeah. Well, you could go over to a nightclub and they'd have American jazz all till 2 a.m. In fact, St. Jean, my buddy up there, a minute back, he used to come staggering in late at night.
You didn't. You didn't come in stagger.
No. No. But we had a good time, and got to see a lot of the sights there in Toronto.
Well, let me ask you a question about, were you aware of pretty much what was going on in the rest of the fighting places, that is?
Oh yeah, we had big maps up there and following the Russian front and all of that. Yeah, we really did.
And you were aware that of course, within the next year they started talking about the invasion of
Oh sure,
of Europe.
yeah. And I was, of course, I was a paper shopper for that latter part of the time I was in Tehran.
Well, what about the British big fight in North Africa with Mali and all that?
Well, of course,
That was fairly close to you. I mean,
yeah, well, it wasn't really not that immediate, no. But well, anyway, along in the fall of 1943, well, we heard that the Big Three were going to meet at Tehran. And of course, I was there in Tehran. And I got assigned during the conference was going on. I was assigned to the residence of the commanding general of the Persian Gulf Command. I was assigned as a courier, so I spent my time while the conference was going on there in the residence of the commanding general. That was old Admiral Harriman was sleeping there, and John Wynant, the American ambassador to London, was there. All the Secret Service were there and sleeping.
Well, did you get to see the Big Three personally?
Oh, I did.
Well, tell us about it.
Well, I got to talk quite a bit with John Wynant. He was a very, very interesting guy. He'd stand around and shoot the bull,
Okay.
shoot the bull with you. And he told me that he told me that the night at Pearl Harbor, he was having dinner with Churchill.
Oh.
And he said that the first thing that Churchill knew about Pearl Harbor was what came over BBC on that radio right there while they were having dinner.
I understand he made some gesture,
Yeah.
thank God it's happened or something.
He didn't tell about that.
Did it?
I didn't find Harriman, I didn't find very, well, he was kind of cold.
Cold fish, huh?
He's a cold fish. But he was, he spent a lot of time with Roosevelt. I saw Pat Hurley, one of some of Roosevelt's president's personal physician was there. One of Roosevelt's sons was there. I forget which one it was.
Jimmy, I think.
Was it?
I think so.
don't remember whoever it was. I wasn't much impressed with him. But,
Well, how about Uncle Joe? Did you get to see him?
yeah, I did. The first night I left, I see that the meeting was going on over in the Russian embassy.
Oh.
I was over in the general's
Head
residence. The first night I got out once from the residence, and I delivered a bottle of scotch. I went over to Churchill, and Churchill gave me I think it was Churchill gave me a bottle. It was either Wesley or Churchill gave me a bottle of scotch to take over, and I took it over to Roosevelt.
Personally?
Yeah, I got it from Churchill. Now, when I got it over to Roosevelt's place, I delivered it to one of his aides or something. I didn't get to see Churchill that night. But anyway, then the next night, I got it. My duty was from 4 to 8, 4 to midnight. I was on duty at there 4 to midnight, and the General Marshall had a note to deliver to another general who was over at the Russian embassy, and I was given that note to deliver to the Russian embassy. So I went over, and of course you don't. Tehran is a mysterious place. But that night
Thief of Baghdad type.
it was more mysterious than ever. The only way you could get around was in a command car. They had streets blacked out. Everywhere you went, there were armored cars. The only way you could move around in that place in Tehran that night was to be in a staff car. So I took a staff car over with the chauffeur. And I got over there to the Russian embassy. Now the Russian embassy is in downtown Tehran. It's a huge place with it. Covers, I'd say more than a block, more than that. It's right next door to the British legation, only an alley or something separates. And they, big high walls, I said, and they had the two legations, big canvas stretched up so nobody could. And before the conference, very few Americans had ever set foot in the Russian embassy. That was a forbidding place. Those Russians, they've got paranoia.
Yeah.
So I drove up in my staff car. I was sitting in the back seat and had a chauffeur in front. And the car pulled up to the gates of the Russian embassy, and the Secret Service man stepped out from the
shadows.
From the shadows. And he opened the door and looked in, saw me, and he knew me. And so he passed the word, and it was okay. And it was just like magic. You know, that Russian officer in charge, how he came to attention, you know, with a big salute like that. And there were two Russian soldiers two on each side, and all those guys came to present arms. And the gate, I fell for, I returned the salute like that. I felt kind of sheepish. I was only a junior grade warrant officer. Well, anyway, we got inside, and the embassy was all lighted up. It was a lot of American soldiers around there, MPs, but gee, Jiminy Cricket, you look around, it was like in the bushes, it was like Walt Disney's Dismal Swamp. These Russian soldiers were all over the place, like, you know, but as I said, they've got paranoia. Like Stalin had.
Yeah.
So I went in, a Russian civilian opened the door for me. I went in and told him,
yeah,
I had a message, and the general that I was supposed to deliver that to, and for the life of me, I don't know who it was in the conference room back where the big table was. And I went in there and delivered this to him. I had a chance then to look around and see the whole thing. It was like a big ballroom where they were meeting with a circular table in the middle. And the principals weren't there at the time. There was some staff working there. In the outer room there were a number of officers of all three nationalities were there, the British, the Americans, and the Russians. And, so I delivered my note to this fellow, and he said, well, he said, wanted me to wait. So I went up. I got myself a chair, and I sat there, and I took charge of the American telephone right outside the door of the conference room. And so by and by, when people started writing, and by gosh, I tell you, I can still remember sitting there and heard that door click open, and in comes Stalin. Marshal Voroshilov was right behind him, and came into the vestibule, and he was he looked just like he looked in the picture. I remember he had a mustard colored uniform there. Yeah. But I remember his sleeves were too long for him. He had a big hammer and sickle on the epaulets, or maybe it was up here in the lapel. I'm not sure which it was. And of course had on a military cap. And boy, when he appeared, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody stood up, of course, as soon as he came in, and he kind of waved his hand like this to us, as much as go ahead and sit down. We did. And he crossed over and went into they had an anteroom there where the Russians were using the reception. And then maybe 10 minutes later, when the door opens again, and here comes Churchill. That was a surprising thing about, I of course had seen lots of pictures of Stalin, but he was shorter than I figured. He was about the same height as Churchill. But of course Churchill was chubby, and Churchill was hot. When he walked in the door there, he was kind of puffy, so he was fat. And but the two were about the same height. Churchill had on a black felt, fedora hat, had on his cane over his arm, and so on. of course, I'd seen him before the previous day. And of course, and he walked in, and when he got there, why, he went on into the conference room, and Roosevelt had, Roosevelt, the first night, slept over at the American legation. But then, as I said, these Russians are paranoid, and they cooked up some story that there was going to be a plot on their lives. And so Roosevelt moved over, and he slept in the Russian embassy. I wondered ever after whether they had blood for him.
Probably did.
But Roosevelt was sitting there of course he was, he couldn't get around.
Was he in a wheelchair?
He was in a wheelchair. He had a gray suit on, and I think he was smoking a cigarette, I'm not sure. But from time to time, just to give you an idea of the difference of it, the difference of attitude of these three nationalities. I happened to be downtown the day that Stalin arrived. I'd gone downtown Tehran. I'd gone down to the American consul's office. I was going in there or something, and he wasn't in or something, and so I went out on the street, and see, Avenue Paladie, I think it is a big, broad brick avenue that goes from all the way down to the railroad station, way out to the Elburz Mountains beyond. It's a wide street, about wider than Washington Street, and Stalin, and every 20 feet there was a Russian soldier with a Tommy gun for just as far as you could see. And of course, all of a sudden, it's like a gust of wind, like Stalin's car went speeding by, and that was it. And to give you an idea on how the Americans handled it, when Roosevelt arrived at the airport out there, the Secret Service met him, and they whisked him through town, through back streets, actually, without letting anybody know. When Churchill arrived, they had the Iranian cavalry out. They had the Iranian cavalry out all up and down those streets, and he was met by the British ambassador, or British minister, and they went like a funeral procession up that street. So you can see the three different approaches. Well, where were we?
Well, I just asked if you actually saw them. You said you got to see all three of them.
And the fellow who was, of course, at Churchill, at Roosevelt's side was Harry Hopkins and Averell Harriman, and Chip Bolin was there too. Chip Bolin was the interpreter. Chip Bolin later became the ambassador to Russia. But he was there interpreting for Roosevelt. Stalin's right-hand man seemed to be Molotov. Molotov was there, and Voroshilov was in there too, but Molotov would come buzzing in and out. He was dressed like a professor. He was kind of bald-headed, and he wore pince-nose glasses, and he'd come buzzing in and out of there. I could see him at one point. Of course, I was right there at the door of the room. There was nobody any closer than I was. The door, when Molotov would come out or something, when I looked in there, I could see him, and there were Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt gathered around a great big map. As I read later, of course, that was the night that they started carving up Eastern Europe. And deciding who was going to have Poland and all that stuff. But then after maybe about 9 o'clock or 9:30 or something like that, why things started breaking up, and Churchill came out went out to the men's room, and a British officer helped him on with the coat, and then I could see, and then the meeting seemed to be over, and Stalin was standing around there smoking a cigar and chewing on it, kind of look, and Roosevelt called in all of staff at the Russian embassy and was thanking him and glad-handing him and all that. And Boland was standing there in Turkey.
He was a politician.
He was a politician. And I was interested to watch Stalin while he was doing that. He kind of stood back there and he had kind of a grin on his face that he saw Roosevelt doing all that handshake. But anyway, they came out and started to get their coats, and they were going on over to a banquet. I never saw any of that. At one point, I was going to help Stalin on with his overcoat, but my better judgment got a hold of me.
They might have frisked you before you went over there.
Anyway, that was about the end of it. Just things kind of, everybody kind of departed, and I went back to the general's billet and took the car back, and kind of like when the circus pulls up and all that stuff was.
Well, how long did you move then from Tehran any time?
No, I was in Tehran all the time.
Rest of the time.
That, by the way, that next morning, Roosevelt came and slept out in our camp that night.
Oh, really?
And they woke up the next morning and we paraded for him, and he went by in his jeep and thanked us all and all that stuff. But I stayed in Tehran, and in the spring of that year, I began to think I was staying too long in one place, and so I applied for, I don't know what, after you look back, you don't know what in the devil possesses you, but I applied for infantry school.
Oh, boy! You should have had your head examined.
Well, I thought I wasn't seeing enough of the action. Of course, I've seen quite a bit of action. But on just about D-Day, or just long about then, I shipped off to the Fort Benning. I flew back to Fort Benning. Flew back first. I flew back to Crawfordsville because it was there I proposed to my wife and we got engaged.
I see.
When I came back, you know that Russia was the source of most of the platinum of the world was mined in Russia. When I came back, they sent me back with 125 pounds of platinum.
My God, how much would that be worth? Near as much as can cocaine.
It was in a box about like so big, and of course kind of heavy. And they sent a sergeant back with me, and I was supposed to be in charge. I was not to let that platinum out of my sight. And so when we got to Cairo, and by the way, the day before we left, a group of us had gone up the Caspian Sea and going swimming. And I got a terrible sunburn. My feet were just giving me the devil. And I went home with that awful sunburn. And I was sick when I got to Cairo. And of course my buddy Bernie Darren had moved over to Cairo by that time, and I think I stayed with him in Cairo for a night or so. And what was I going to do with this doggone platinum I had? So I checked it in at the postal department and left it with them, and I did a little looking at the Sphinx and that sort of thing, but I was pretty sick. And the next night, I took a plane, a mail plane, to go across Africa. And I got in that mail plane about dusk, all piled up, the mail bags all over the thing, you know, no place to sit. So I just laid out on top of the mail plane.
Yeah.
About, I don't know how much later, I woke up and we were hitting ground. We were going down. And the plane, it was on one of those old, I don't know what those mail planes were, but they had lost all their oil.
Oh, man. DC-3 or something?
Something like that. And we were at them, and we put down out on the desert near Benghazi. You ever heard about Benghazi?
Sure.
And of course, the Germans were right across the Mediterranean there, and the camp at Benghazi was blacked out. But they, somehow or other, and also the radio, part of the radio had gone out, and the pilot had not been able to communicate his distress.
Oh.
So, but somehow or other, the British put out flares out on the desert for us. We didn't land at the airport. We landed out on the desert between those flares. And so I spent the night, the sergeant and I spent the night on the desert out there with
nursing the platinum.
Nursing the doggone platinum. It was the rest of them went into the British barracks. But so I went across, and I think I stopped at Algiers and stopped at Casablanca. At Casablanca, I picked up, I think, a C-54, and the Platinum and I got on board, and we flew in through over the Azores and up through Gander and down and landed in Washington, D.C. And I was supposed to land at New York with that Platinum, but when I got to, they gave me a number to call when I got there, and I telephoned the number and told them I was there, and they told me what to do with the Platinum, and I got rid of it.
Turn over to some of the
Postal authorities, I think, and I was going to get rid of it.
I think so.
And it was kind of a lodestone, long excursion. Meanwhile, I was suffering from sunburn. But I got back to the States and hopped on a train and took the P&E from Indianapolis over to, no, wait a minute. I think my wife to be met me at the station.
Say that was busy in those days, wasn't it?
Union Station in Indianapolis, and we went back to Calvertville, and we got engaged, and then I went up and I had about a week, I think, before starting at Fort Benning. And so I went to Fort Benning, and I was 29 years old by that time, and most of those guys that were there were 18, 19, just out of high school. And you can just see me going up those rope ladders, trying to keep up with them.
I had to do that.
And by the way, another interesting thing about that, when we got to Fort Benning, and those were real fine fellows. Those guys at Fort Benning, they were sharp.
Yeah.
They were, and all those OCS ones those were clean cut. They were good officer material.
Well, the 29th Infantry was the school troops. Were they still there?
I don't remember. But they were, and another thing that I noticed was that by the time we got there, we were pretty well integrated. They had the black fellows in the same class with us, and they were treated the same as we were. They weren't segregated anymore. Of course, that was 1944, and I guess things had changed a little bit. And there were some real fine black officer candidates. and sort of another interesting thing was when they heard about, they had a post newspaper, it's called the Shave Tail. And when they heard about me, and they sent a reporter around to interview me and talk about the conference, about the Teheran Conference. And so when that newspaper article came out, I sent a copy up to Marion Kirtley in Provinceville, and she wrote back to me, and she said, "The big three begins to sound like the big four, doesn't it?"
Good for her.
Well, anyway,
Well, did you have 13 weeks there, or did they shorten the course?
No, I was 13.
13 weeks.
And by God, you know, I had never fired an M1 rifle before.
Is that?
I've never had an M1 rifle.
Well, were you armed with a carbine before?
No, I was armed with a Springfield.
Oh, Springfield, yeah, beg your pardon. Yeah.
And you know, I was the best shot in the infantry school,
Hey.
in my class.
Great.
Best shot I had. I made expert in standing and sitting and kneeling and prone and all of it.
Well, you got a little medal that did.
Well, I got an expert.
Yeah, all right.
And in fact, I was said, I don't know how it was. I think I learned to squeeze the trigger.
Yeah,
I learned to squeeze the trigger. That's the, and it was that's the thing that does it.
Well, I qualified in the Tommy gun.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, those guys were shooting Tommy guns too. But anyway, I was. I graduated, of course, and
Where you got a second lieutenant's
got a
position?
second lieutenant, and I thought I was going, and they wanted me to stay on as a TAC officer, but I didn't want to do that. And so I was shipped to Camp Joseph T. Robinson, Arkansas. I thought I was going to be out in the field. But lo and behold, I wound up back in headquarters again, and I was a classification assignment officer. Still a second lieutenant when the war ended. But that was it.
Were you discharged, separated from the service, I guess?
That was at Fort Sheridan.
Fort Sheridan.
Yeah.
And early out, were you?
I got out, they let me out in January of 45. Yeah. I had been, I did go to, while I was at Robinson, I went over, I was at Camp Lee at the Adjutant General School. Of course, I was an infantry officer, but I was in Adjutant General.
Right. Branch.
Yeah. And so then my wife and I we got married right after I got out of infantry school. And we went as husband and wife down there to Camp Robinson. And that was it.
And then you were, were you separated, you said Fort Sheridan.
Fort Sheridan.
Then you came to Carversville right after that?
Yeah. Well, I see. I had never passed I wasn't a member of the Indiana Bar.
Oh, I see.
And I thought I was going to have to hang out my shingle in Illinois because there wasn't licensed practice here.
Yeah, right.
And but we felt the ties pretty strong here, so I took the bar examination again in Indiana and passed the bar again here. And
was it easier than Illinois?
It was about the same. As a matter of fact, you know, I went up to Chicago to get my Indiana residence. I couldn't get a job. I didn't have any job here, but my dad was in business up in Chicago. So my wife stayed here, and I went up to Chicago and worked during the week and came back on the home every weekend. And by the middle of the summer, I had gotten notice of passing the bar, and I started open practice in August of 45.
Well, now, did you go in with Dick, or was that later?
Dick came later. Dick was with Baker and Daniels over in Indianapolis, as you know, and but he decided he wanted to practice in tropics development. So he came over, and of course our families, my wife's family and Dick's family, they're good friends, and we joined up in about 48. That was the year that I got beaten for prosecutor. Ran in the primary and lost it, Earl Snyder. Then I got called back, of course, during the Korean War.
How long?
As you know, I was in about 18 months.
18?
I got called back. They called me back as an instructor over at the Adjutant General School at Fort Harris. So I slept here in Crawfordville and drove back and forth every night.
So you're a veteran of 2 wars.
I'm a veteran of 2 wars. Funny thing about it, you know, I said goodbye to my commanding officer down there at Camp Robinson, Arkansas. In January of 46. And his name was Colonel Shelton, AG officer. And of course I got my papers for Korea in 41.
Oh, it's 50.
I'm 50 or 51 or whatever it was. And my wife was livid. She was madder than I was about me being called back. So, and she wrote to Anna Rosenberg, and she did everything else, but didn't do. I think I got about a 60-day deferment or a 90-day deferment or something like that. And I was just setting up law practice.
Yeah.
I just started getting a few clients. Dick was in with me by
Well, that,
but I walked into that headquarters, I walked into that office over at
Fort Harris.
Fort Harrison, and there was Colonel Shelton standing there.
How about that?
I was flabbergasted.
I think so.
And he said, "Where have you been? I've been waiting for you."
That's great.
But of course I was an AG officer, and there weren't too many of us around. So,
Well, then later your family came to old Doc Kirtley, didn't they?
yeah, that's right. And you delivered Helen.
Right, exactly. Well, that was a great honor for me, I tell
It
you.
was a wonderful thing.
Well, Bob, I think most interesting.
Yeah.
And I think this will be a great series.
Well, I hope so. We hope we'll get some more. We've got Guadalcanal coming up.
Right.
Okay. That'll be all. I'm Bob Wernle, and we're talking, going to do a little addendum for our tapes that we did earlier, and Coop wants to add a few things to his, and I thought that I ought to make a few corrections, or just a correction or two on mine that when I was interviewed by Marion Kirtley.
Oh, good man.
Yes, and they were yours.
They were mine, and also, we were in the same territory.
Yeah.
We really were,
Yeah.
close.
Well, one thing that I told Marion that I want to correct, I talked about that Christmas Day when we were in Wellington, New Zealand, when our troop ship was in a harbor there, and they led us all off to march down the main street of Wellington. And all those and the people from Wellington were so grateful to see all those American troops, 15,000 troops marching down the main street. And I said that Marion asked me whether we had our rifles, and I was wrong on that, I'm sure, because we didn't carry our rifles on marching. I'm sure it would have been more impressive if we had those rifles. Another thing that we have talked about, and I think it's important on each one of these interviews, is whether these fellows attend any reunions. Mm-hmm. Are you still meeting with the fellows that you knew back in the service? And I want to comment about my own experience on that. Now, for the most part, I haven't seen these fellows in years. Of people that I was with at Camp Robinson, we were when my wife and I were there, we kept track of some of them, one or two, and some of them been here to Crawfordsville since. But the main group that we had, the Oglethorpe 7, those are the fellows that I was with at Camp Oglethorpe, Georgia, and I was with over in Teheran. We have kept in touch all these years. There were 7 of us. We used to, when we were in Tehran, the 7 of us would go down to a cafe there, and one of the things that we enjoyed doing was having drinking wine down there in a fancy French restaurant, and then at the end of dinner we'd have B&B, Benedictine and brandy. And we've attended, and we are now having reunions. And one of the traditions is that when we meet, we have a bottle of B&B, and they all have a little nip of that.
Not too much.
Not too. You don't drink very much of that. It clears your nose. Well, we do have reunions, the 7 of us. Well, last year, this past year, we met at St. Louis. As a matter of fact, the whole Persian Gulf Command has a reunion. But the 7 of us who were in headquarters, there are 6 of us still living. One of them was murdered back about 10-20 years ago. Harvey St. Jean, he was a swinger among a group of us. Most of us guys were pretty straight. We're square. But Harvey St. Jean, after he got out of the service, went to law school and became quite a prominent defense attorney for criminals. And he defended some famous people on criminal charges, and but he wound up getting shot to death, and it was kind of a mysterious death.
Maybe one of them didn't do too good a job.
Could have been. But then as a matter of fact, we met down in Chattanooga, I guess about 5 years ago, and when we met there, Chattanooga is where we'd gone to school, Fort Oglethorpe, and we had an empty chair for good old Harvey St. Jean. Well, we've met since at Kalamazoo. We've met, as I said, St. Louis last year. We met in Orlando. We've met down in Dayton, Ohio. But we all try to get together. Since being in the service, of course, I've come back here to Crawfordsville and practiced law. Harvey, as I said, studied to be a lawyer and became quite a prominent attorney. John Cave, who, by the way, was married. He married a nurse over in Iran while he was there, and John now is was for many years a circuit judge down in Fulton, Missouri. Milton Fields lives up on the north side of the north end of North Shore of Chicago, and he's a practicing attorney and a CPA. Marvin Boyd, who came back, and he was chief of police in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Let's see, I forget who I missed on that. Oh, Phil Kopstein who was with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. He got to be the chief, the agent in charge in the Manhattan branch. Had about 75 agents working under him. He's the oldest one of us. He's in his 80s. Bernie Darren was the only one who stayed in government service, and he was with OSS and then the CIA, and he got to be, he went over to, he married, he was married to a lady who was also in the OSS and CIA, and they were over in Meshed, way over in northeastern Iran. He was the American consul over there. But we've corresponded. We write to each other at over the holidays, and of course enjoy this next year. We're going to go out to Buffalo, New York for a reunion. So that I think that's one of the important things about the service, the fellows you meet. Another thing that we're proud of, every one of us is married to the same woman that
They started out.
they started out with way back during World War II, and we're kind of proud of that. So that's about all that I had to say. But
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
well, Mike has gone to answer the telephone,
Yeah.
so maybe this will.
Do you know how to shut it off?
No, I don't know how to shut it off.
Maybe I can go
But
shut it
why
off.
don't, Cooper, you know, you and I have met right after the war.
Yeah.
It started back,
Yeah.
when was it you came back?
87.
47, yeah. I remember going over with you to Fort Harrison.
Yes, sir. I went out there to see a fellow that had been captured. I knew he was out there. Turned out to be a pretty big mistake because he and another guy came over here to my home, and we got, had a few drinks, and so we went downtown, and they really laid one on, see, and I didn't get home.
You had to be responsible for it.
And they got out the edge of town there and pulled off the side of the road and slept till about 9 o'clock the next morning. But no more of that, never gonna have that.
I remember over at, that's one of the things that, I think I remember talking to you about this. I went over there, I was over at Fort Harrison one time, and we met I knew a guy whose last name was Minor from over in Iran. And his nickname was Asia Minor.
Asia Minor.
And at the time that I think maybe when you and I went over there that we saw the guy or something.
That's pretty, that's one thing about making these tapes is that you're remembering back almost, 50 years? In other cases, it is 50 years. This will be, it's past 50 years for me because I went in and, as I told you, in February of 49 or 41, see.
Yeah.
So February's passed, so that is 50
Yeah,
years.
it's 50 years. Well, it's a strange thing. I was thinking about it, just in those first few days that I was at Camp Grant. I got to know a guy named Walter Seiler, I think it's S-E-Y-L-A-R or something like that. And he and I, just in 2, 3, or 4 or 5 days, or maybe a week or more, got to be real good friends. And I remember going out when he got ready to leave, he was I was just all broken up. Haven't seen him since. But what a show.